We are joined now by the Energy Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And one of the things that's central at Davos right now, Minister, has been this whole question of transitioning the world economy to greener, more sustainable efforts. And you have at the table, right, the biggest oil-producing nations, the biggest oil companies. Canada, of course, is a microcosm of that very same trouble. You've just come from a cabinet retreat, and I'm curious, it may not have come up at that retreat, but the Frontier project in Alberta is on the table. There have got pros and cons on either side of this massive project. It's a kind of a mini microcosm of the problem Canada faces. We believe in climate change and sustainability. We believe in our energy sector. Let's start right there with your thoughts on Frontier.
Well, I would say, first of all, we've got to find a way to transition the economy over time in a manner that both meets our climate objectives, which is net zero by 2050, but does so in a way that is thoughtful and sensitive to the aspirations of all regions, including the hydrocarbon-producing regions in Canada. The Tech Frontier is one project, and of course, as all projects, it needs to be assessed on the basis of its environmental impacts. That's the process that it has been going through over the last number of years. There are significant negative environmental impacts, and so we're at the stage where Cabinet will have to make a determination as to what is called, are they justified in the circumstances? Mm-hmm. And certainly we will have to look at all of the environmental impacts, but one of those certainly is the climate change and how it reconciles with Canada's climate commitments.
Politically, the problem with this issue, of course, is I feel like the government has to be in middle ground, right? There is middle ground to be found here, and the government has to find it. But the people who occupy the either end of the spectrum are loud and passionate and committed to their position. They're not really budging at either end. How do you get them, and all Canadians really, into some middle place where both is possible?
Well, I think, we have to have a dialogue that's as inclusive as possible. I'm not sure that you're ever going to get unanimity on the part of Canadians on this particular project or on the climate file more generally. But I think what we need to strive for is to be inclusive such that we have the vast majority of Canadians who agree that the measures that are being taken by their governments and by other interested stakeholders are reasonable in the context of, what everybody agrees. I think that we need to achieve is making substantial progress on climate.
You've been talking to business leaders, including a group that's dedicated to looking at kind of how we achieve goals. What are you hearing? What's the kind of level of optimism around some of our goals, including 2030 goals?
Well, I think, the commitment to net zero by 2050 has actually opened up an opportunity for a much more productive conversation in all regions of the country. Mm-hmm. I was in Calgary before Christmas meeting with many of the major oil companies, and most of them said to me, we agree, net zero by 2050 is the right target. We want to be part of the conversation about how we get there. There are many pathways to get there, and they want to be part of defining that. I think that's a very positive step. I would say to you that I think that conversation is one that over time will help us to bridge some of the divides that we've seen. I think in the short term, we have some difficult choices to make, and particularly around some projects. But I do think that there is a lot of goodwill, and I think the vast majority of Canadians understand that climate change is an existential threat. We need to address it, but we need to be smart how we do that.
Where you get there with the kind of being smart is incrementalism. And we do have, of course, these very powerful voices, growing voices, and we'd add from the business community, BlackRock, just recently saying we're going to start pricing in the genuine cost of climate change, what it means on balance sheets, not in our heads or in any debate. When we think that way, what we're being asked to do does feel more like a collective global effort akin to a world war. How do we get people's kind of minds there, which is expensive, which does involve sacrifice, which is not easy or fun or incremental? Those are big, hard steps.
They are big, hard steps, and I would say first and foremost, it's not government that can do everything. We need commitments on the part of industry, environmental organizations, and others. I was meeting earlier today with members of the Sustainable Finance Commission we set up, which is really about mobilizing private capital, which has far more capital than governments, to really take on the climate challenge. And I am very optimistic in terms of what I hear from the business community about their commitment to doing this and to seeing a pathway not only to address our environmental issues, but to transform our economy in a way that's going to be very positive.
It's great to have you here for this. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.